Okay, good morning and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the 15th Annual State of the Treasury Profession webinar. As you may know, TSI conducts a survey each year in which we ask treasurers about their priorities and challenges. We also augment the research by conducting interviews with treasurers. We are pleased to share the results with you today. This session will be led by Jeff Diorio and Paul LaRock, both of whom are directors and co-heads of Treasury Strategies. We encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded. You will receive a recording link and a copy of the presentation following the session. On to you, Jeff.
Thank you, Kyler. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our 15th Annual State of the Treasury webinar. This year, obviously, the pandemic has impacted everybody pretty dramatically. Treasury has had responses to it. And there are some very positive things that have come out of it for Treasury, along with all the bad things that have happened. And we'd like to talk about this, and our main theme is evolving to the new normal. So thank you to everyone who took the online survey, and we want to especially thank those who participated in the interviews. We will be taking questions through Q&A. If we don't have time to address any of them by the end of the webinar, we will gladly respond in writing. So if you have questions, do note them and or just reach out to us outside this webinar. So today's agenda, we'll be talking about the current market forces that are impacting Treasury and the survey results from the online survey, which I think are very interesting and slightly different this year than in years past. And then the interviews, where we asked an additional question, which was, what changes did you enact in response to the pandemic? And then we get into opportunity and risks for 2021 and the Treasurer's to-do list. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Paul LaRock. Paul, take it away.
Good morning, everybody. So our approach to learning what treasurers are thinking, what their plans are in the future, is a two-pronged approach. We do an online survey with several dozen questions that treasurers can ask. And then we complement that with maybe 60, 70 interviews of treasurers, which are more in-depth. And it's important when looking at this information gathering, which was done from December of last year until March of this year, that it happens in a context. So to give you some contextual knowledge of what was going on during the survey, most of which is continuing now. The big contextual elements are the economic impact of the pandemic. And there's two aspects to that economic impact. The first is a historically enormous contraction in global GDP and international trade. And that, of course, is in the March to May period last year. And then the reverse, beginning in fourth quarter of last year and continuing now, as economies open in many countries of the world, there's dramatic expansion. And so that affects treasurers' borrowing, investing. It affects the cash flows of companies who might have seen their payroll contract dramatically in the second quarter of last year are now going into hiring phase, and that's ramping up quickly. There's been a huge impact on the workforce. The first is millions of workers in the United States and Europe and Asia becoming unemployed. And now we're going into a stage where there's rapid hiring and historically high job growth. A lot of that is attributable to the US federal government, our central bank, the Federal Reserve, as well as governments in Asia and Europe trying to mitigate the contraction in the economy. And so, for example, in the US, in the second quarter of last year, the combined financial impact of what the US Congress did and the central bank in one quarter was equal to one quarter's GDP. And so if you put that much money into the economy, you can obviously have a big effect, and it did. And so now we started the pandemic with low interest rates, and now they're even lower. We have clients that have nearly negative interest rates on their ECR. Inflation was very low. We will talk about inflation. A number of treasurers shared with us their inflation concerns. And it's kind of, we're not in the business of making inflation predictions, so we're not going to give you a prediction, but we can tell you what treasurers told us.
And Paul and I go back and forth on this. So, one saying it's inflationary and the other saying it's not. But I do know that some treasurers said they perceived inflation coming, and then others said no. One of the more famous quotes from the interviews was, when the government gets comfortable discussing budgets, spend in the trillions of dollars, that has to be inflationary. But are there any indications right now? We'll get into that. The other factors and forces that we think are impacting, and you will see this in the results of the survey and the interviews, is there are some very nice new technologies that organizations are taking advantage of. The fraud attempts have only gotten worse, and that is causing organizations to defensively react to them, which they should. And then there's the Libor replacement, which we'll talk about. That is going to be impactful. It is coming. It's not something you can avoid. And then Paul, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about Brexit, because while some of our attendees are domestic, a lot of them are global organizations.
Right. So the good news with Brexit came yesterday when the European Parliament approved the trade agreement. So that removes some uncertainty around trade, but financial services regulation isn't included in that legislation. And so everyone is operating under interim rules right now in terms of banking. And so these regulations and what ultimately is decided directly affects the banks, particularly operations centers in the UK, whether they can stay there or they have to move all their staff. A lot of stock trading shifted to the continent, but the backroom settlement operations are still in the UK. It's uncertain how long they'll stay. Maybe they'll stay forever or maybe not. And to the extent that banks experience that regulatory uncertainty and make decisions about their operations, that will indirectly affect companies, specifically around pooling, trade settlement, where the support staff is located in Europe. And I use Europe in the traditional phrase, both the UK and continental Europe, whether they'll be in the UK, Ireland, maybe Belgium. That will play out, I think, over the next 18 months. And banks are just uncertain about what they will be called upon to do in order to meet the final regulations.
Thanks, Paul. So on to the survey results. We conduct an online survey this year. We changed the format a little bit to ask some additional questions about what services you were considering changing and that sort of thing. But the primary request is to what are your priorities for the year? And when you look at the results, you'll notice that the top three have been, top 5 items for the last several years, and this goes way back. The bottom 2 clearly have jumped up. But what I find interesting about the top 3 is we believe that the reason that these are top 3 this year is different than the reason they were top 3 or 4 last year. Last year, going into the survey was pre-pandemic, and a lot of organizations were thinking proactively about what they should be doing, and maybe there was some consideration for preparing for the pandemic, but I don't think anybody could have prepared for what actually happened. And if you remember a year ago, there was it was quite a bit of uncertainty. So, for instance, forecasting improvements definitely changed. So a year ago, folks were thinking more about, proper working capital liquidity management. And then as the year progressed, folks were just trying to get a handle on where the money was and to understand exactly what their liquidity position was in reaction to the dramatic change in revenue and those sorts of things. So we do feel that the forecasting, the liquidity, the bank service optimization, all of those things were almost accelerated because of the pandemic, and we'll get into why. on the optimization or replacement of technology, we'll talk about that quite a bit. It's always been something that Treasury and Finance have utilized and leveraged, and there were exposures in reaction to the disbursement of work and the way people started working remotely. And we are seeing a dramatic increase in attention on that. And we'll talk about that as part of the output of the interviews. And then, of course, there's the reaction to fraud attempts. And while this has always been on everybody's mind, I think they have jumped up in priority because of the remote work environment and the increase in attacks, and also organizations. So in 2021, we see many of these things prioritized in more of a defensive vein than in a proactive vein. Paul, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, there's something I'll point out to our viewers. Cybersecurity and enhanced fraud, it ranks 5 in terms of Treasury priorities in the work they're doing. And you'll see later that it's 1 or nearly the first in terms of concerns and threats. And so to reconcile those 2 kind of almost counterintuitive replies, treasurers are very concerned about cybersecurity and fraud, but they're not the ones who do most of the technical work. The IT departments do it. So although it's something that affects them, they're not the ones who come up with most of the solutions. They come up with part of the solutions. They can check their treasury management systems, make sure best practices are being followed in terms of systematic, preventative, and detective controls. But they're not the ones responsible for the firewalls. They're not the ones responsible for chasing down phishing attacks and things like that. So huge concern, but something they have to rely on the IT departments to focus on. There's also a theme you'll see is process improvements. And so that moderate level concern or priority, I think, has been amplified by the pandemic, in which case a lot of paper-based operations were disrupted by people being ill, by print rooms in companies shutting down. And with remote work, the idea of trying to make everything electronic in a straight-through process has really come front of mind. And we're seeing a lot of companies putting their money where their mouth is in order to change things.
Very much so, Paul, very much. We definitely feel that improvements in payment process, and there's a lot of different angles on why organizations looked at it, but it's definitely tied in with mitigating the risks with cyber fraud. Okay.
We also, on prayer surveys, we heard treasurers talking about considering robotics and artificial intelligence in cash forecasting. And in the past year, we've seen treasurers actually do that,
Yes.
where they actually hire the consulting firms to do that work. So it goes from being a concept to an operating reality in a few companies. Most companies are not doing that yet. I think most companies are talking about it, but there's a few who are finally implementing that into their process.
Yes, it's moved beyond the toe in the water phase into some organizations are definitely moving down that path.
Yeah.
So the interviews, in concert with the online survey, we conduct interviews. We ask very open-ended questions and allow the participants to pretty much say anything that's on their mind. The consistency in what they say is very, very interesting. And so we'll step right in. The first question we asked this year was, what changes did you put in place because of your organization's reaction to the pandemic? And which of those did you feel were permanent changes and which of them were temporary changes? And so along that line, Paul, what are your read on the responses?
So the permanent changes, kind of thinking about the overall process improvement theme that we heard again and again this year. One of them was getting away from wet signatures. Multiple treasurers told us, we're never going back to the old way. This is so much better. And the migration from not just not doing checks, but invoices incoming and outgoing, and work tickets and things all being done online, because people are at home. And so moving the paper around when you're all in different houses is obviously problematic.
And opening and closing bank accounts and even debt issuances, some folks said it's a miracle.
Yeah,
We were able to do it electronically.
yeah. And so the treasurers we spoke to were adamant that that is a permanent change. They're not going back. Anytime they've eliminated a paper process, they are not going back. There's a more complete automation of Treasury in terms of more effectively using Treasury management systems that companies have invested in. A lot with remote work technology. You're looking at some of it right now through Zoom, and that a lot of Treasury staff that maybe didn't use Zoom or Microsoft Teams or the others are experts in that now. Remote work is a more remote work is a permanent feature. We will talk about staffing in more detail later, but there are some long-term changes in how Treasury departments and their sister departments and finance, accounting, AR, et cetera, will operate. And we saw a consistent long-term emphasis on forecasting. So to the extent companies were periodically doing forecasting, they're doing it more consistently now and at a much more detailed level than I'm used to seeing. And
the desire for accuracy, or it's forecasting, so you can't be perfect, but enhanced accuracy of the forecast.
Yeah, and I saw a few companies. I see a clustering in a certain industry in healthcare that they're going to consistently do this because they needed to do it in March and April. And their view is this pandemic isn't over. And there could be backsliding for a variety of reasons. And I thought it was interesting that the healthcare treasurers were cautiously optimistic about the year ahead. So.
Yes, and I think everybody should take some positive from that. On the temporary side, obviously everybody a year ago, majority of organizations didn't know what was going to happen financially, so they drew down excess liquidity. That's mostly gone back. But the transition back from 100% remote work is a very interesting conversation. And this goes to the migration to the new normal. What does hybrid look like? And we're probably going to talk about it for the next several slides because it was a big thing. Two treasurers, and is it 100% back in the office? Is it 3 days a week back in the office? Do we let people that want to work permanently outside the office work permanently outside the office? I think all of that, and there are positives and negatives to it, but all of that is something that is still, or the cake is still in the oven. It's not done. Okay, the second question we asked, and this is a two-part question, but we asked treasurers, what do you see as opportunities in 2021? And Paul, you had some thoughts about, obviously cheap money.
Yeah, and so treasurers in general, particularly those who think that in the year ahead we're going to have higher inflation, feel a sense of urgency that if they're going to borrow long-term in the next 12 months, they need to start doing that now. There's a long-term concern about process optimization. So that's something that's existed for years. It's a higher priority now. And closely associated with that is optimizing the technology to enhance that. And I think,
but I think more so, Paul, it's the optimization of the payment process.
Yes, both incoming and outgoing, by the way. So we're using the term payments here. We're not talking about just outgoing payments, but also the whole order to cash cycle is important.
Yeah, and then we see a lot of organizations finally looking to put systems in place, getting permission to put systems in place that they've wanted for quite a while, or identifying that, I think the way one treasurer put it was, when we went remote, most everything worked fine. we weren't really planning on it being 12 months. We thought it would be a couple of weeks, but most everything with our DR plans and our ability to work remotely worked fine. What we found was there were cracks. There were some areas within our workflow, our processes, our technology that weren't perfect. And when we were all in the office together, they were somewhat papered over, so it wasn't so glaring. And it's when we went remote that these became more apparent. And we have more than enough evidence to prove that organizations finally got the budget and the remit to go ahead and improve their automation. One treasurer said, and I think it's really on the next slide, but she said, we realized we were one person deep in a couple of areas. And so that's something we needed to address. And then the tier 2 response.
And that one person deep concept has to do with some written documentation that some people brought up to us, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation.
Right. And the tier 2 responses are really more along the lines of tactical items, or call them standard operating approach of Treasury. And you can see here the cash conversion cycle improvements. That it's at the top of that list for a reason, right, Paul?
Yeah. So it's, first of all, it's something that we encourage, in the sense that you should think about the entire bill to pay and order to cash cycles in parallel with one another. Think about all of the work steps associated with money coming into your organization and money going out, and work to enhance those in parallel. The reality is most treasurers think that's a big lift, and they'll work in subcomponents of one or the other. Most treasurers believe that the biggest benefits are on the collection side, but there's a few who would make the case actually it's more on the disbursement side. So that varies with the organization. And associated with that is bank rationalization, is consolidating banks, moving business in a more thoughtful manner to certain banks in order to take advantage of the technology and the pricing available from them. The team and staffing goes hand in hand with process automation. Maybe you don't need to expand staff like you would if your company was growing in a more non-automated manner. And so the staffing levels is a byproduct of automation. I thought non-bank payments was interesting because everybody's talking about it. We have multiple charitable organizations, non-for-profits, who are very interested in getting digital payments from donors. And they draw analogies to Venmo, and Venmo actually isn't in that business right now. It's C2C, but also talking about MasterCard Send, Zelle, PayPal, and all these have something in common, is that they're consumer facing. And one thing that was interesting is that we don't have anybody that is seriously considering putting in digital currencies. And my view of things like Bitcoin is kind of shared by treasurers, that it's almost like introducing a foreign currency, a highly volatile foreign currency, into your payments. I will point out something that I think our audience should monitor in the year ahead, and that is the Central Bank of China's introduction of a digital currency. That'd be the first digital currency that you could actually use to pay your taxes and backed by a central bank. And that has actually been introduced in several cities in a test form. It's carried on a cell phone, and it will be a very prominent feature of payments at the Winter Games in February in China. And so they're really pushing to get away from cash in China, and they intend to use digital currency on phones to do that. I think our Federal Reserve will be called upon by Congress, if not to implement it, then to certainly give reasons, pro and con, to Congress about where the U.S. should position itself long-term in terms of having a central bank back a digital currency.
Yep. And I look at this and you know, we conducted these interviews and we talked to all kinds of different organizations, Paul mentioned not-for-profits, manufacturing, insurance, all kinds of insurance, really everybody. It was across the board. And there were some consistencies, and you can see here the cash conversion cycle, the liquidity optimization, the banking rationalization, which is another way to save money, especially in an environment where net effective ECR could be negative for some of you, and the forecasting. And all of these were about optimizing your use of your liquidity and making sure that you were adhering to all of the requirements necessary. I did hear on the cash conversion cycle improvement, several folks were aware that their organizations were not necessarily adhering to the rule of the contract and the payment. And so getting them to be more consistent in paying when they were supposed to be paying, not early, and also in some cases trying to extend that to get that working capital cash conversion cycle optimized was pretty key. Okay, so the second part of this two-part question is, what risks did you see in 2020? Do you see in 2021? What are top of mind for you? And so the number one this year, as well as the number one in every prior year, is fraud and cyber risk. And I recall the treasurer saying to me 2 years ago, the last thing I want to do is go in front of the board and explain why $25 million went someplace it shouldn't go. And the attacks have gone up. The attacks could be against your organization, but what Treasury care about is certainly in the payment stream, protecting it, making sure that it is well covered. And then the other item that I found, just an awful lot of thought had gone into it, and I'm sure you're all thinking about it. And this was a term that one of the treasurers said to me was, it's the human capital risk. It's our team, it's our people. How do we onboard people when in the last year, some of them may never have met any of us in person? And how do you develop a treasury staff when they don't have the opportunity to sit in the office with you and look over your shoulder, and you don't have the opportunity to look over their shoulder? Because as one treasurer put it, Treasury is a very experiential onboarding. And so while it's wonderful, some folks were ecstatic about the fact that they could hire people across the country now. They could tap into a much broader talent pool, and the organization didn't need to worry about everybody being, say, for instance, in Chicago or able to show up for work in Chicago every day. That's a wonderful benefit. But on the flip side of it, there was quite a bit of discussion about, folks that are more established in their career don't quite need the face-to-face or the networking or the ability to, inquire of their peers how to do things quite so much. But the more junior staff, there was definitely quite a bit of focus, and this goes to evolving into the new normal, quite a bit of focus on how do we now onboard people? How do we ensure that they understand the corporate culture? How do we instill the proper work ethic in them? And I'm sure everybody on this call is somehow impacted by this. Paul and I have an associate working with us who we've never met in person. And so while we're consultants and we're sort of used to working remotely and team building and that sort of thing, it's a challenge, and it's a new challenge, and it's a challenge we all have to adapt to. The negative side of it also gets into making sure that people's health and welfare is considered, and that they're not experiencing undue stress because of the new work environment.
Jeff, I've been doing these interviews from the very beginning. For 15 years, I've been doing this. I've never talked so much to treasurers about staff and professional development as this year. That head and shoulders above all other years, that was a topic they wanted to talk about. Yeah, and then I'll take the next to the low rate impact on investments. If you're a net investor, We're just telling you something you already know, is that unless you're willing to go out on the yield curve in terms of maturity or take on enhanced risk, there's near zero interest rates in the US. It could be worse in Europe. They're negative in France and Germany. And then we have these kind of, two groups of treasurers. Some believing that low rates are here for the indefinite future, but then a minority who would disagree with their peers on that and saying, oh no, inflation is going to heat up, the Federal Reserve will react, and we are headed in the next year towards higher interest rates. And so that's two different views on the same topic.
It's fascinating, and I think day to day people's opinions on this change. I started working in the 1980s in fixed income, and the current rate was well over 10%. I don't know that most people in the last 20 years would recognize an environment like that.
Yeah.
And we were hearing things like, well, how can the government spend this kind of money without it being inflationary? But the indicators aren't quite showing it. But there is a lot of anecdotal evidence. Our former boss, Tony Carfang, really believes that the situation is ripe for it. But then I've spoken to others who say, it's not going to happen, at least in the near term. And then, Paul, you mentioned to me the other day, the supply chain issues might be exacerbating the situation.
Yeah, so that's not something in the future. That's already happening. And so real quickly, you had serious trade disputes between the US and its trading partners that were disruptive to trade, followed immediately by a pandemic that shut down production, disrupted shipping. And now they're unraveling the queue line of ships out in the port of Los Angeles. In Egypt, the Suez Canal is now flowing again. All of that disrupts container traffic. One thing that, and see, our treasurers aren't involved in this part of the business. I really wonder if it's going to affect the safety stock levels that factories keep. Decades ago, they used to keep inventory assuming disruptions in shipping and delivery. And over the last 20, 30 years, there has been such an embrace and so much improvement in delivery times of critical subcomponents that companies don't stockpile lots of spare parts in order to accommodate disruptions in shipping. And I wonder if that will change in the year ahead. And I think that will impact investments in working capital that treasurers have to oversee.
Yep. And then the secondary risks, touched on items that we've already talked about. But the bigger one, I think, is the internal and external operational processes. And Paul, you've done a lot of work on this in the last year.
Yeah, and this again is another aspect of the whole process improvement. And here, treasurers were unsettled by operational, internal, external operational controls associated with people working from home. They were thinking about, now the laptop is in a different environment. Are those laptops vulnerable to hacking? We know the answer is yes, they are more vulnerable. Companies have reacted to that. And so if you have people working from home, maybe not even the same city anymore, they've moved, then one has to think about controls a little bit more thoughtfully and how that change in geography of the employee and the business process might affect the controls around financial fraud, people hacking into employees' laptops, things like that.
Yeah, and this is where the comment about we were one deep or we found cracks in the process that were papered over, this is where the rubber meets the road on that. And organizations are very much looking at these workflows and processes and making sure that somebody can take vacation and the organization doesn't have to wait for them to return, that sort of thing. And the final item here for me to talk about is the Libor replacement. It is being replaced. We did a webinar 2 weeks ago and somebody asked the question, didn't this get delayed? And yes, the dates shift around a teeny bit, but this is happening and it's happening very quickly. And there's two things that you need to think about. The first, and it seems like folks prioritize one over the other, but the first is, can your systems accommodate it without an upgrade? So some organizations are at risk. If you switch from Libor to, say, SOFR and the other international risk-free rates, the method of calculation, while not crazy, it's not like VAR, but it is complicated. And if you get one rate wrong on one date, you're going to be in a discussion with your counterparty about why you think the payment should be this and they think the payment should be that. And that's not a question you want to deal with. And also, of course, it goes to your ability to maintain your fiduciary responsibility. You know, are you accurate or are you not accurate? So many systems, if they're installed, have to be upgraded. And while the vendors may be ready with the upgrade, the question is, can you get it in time and get it configured? And some treasurers have said to me, oh, we'll just do it in Excel, which probably is what a lot of people are going to be doing, but that's not a good answer, especially because you've got, you know, SOX requirements and that sort of thing that will stop you from that. The other side of it is the bank loan restructuring. So most of you have revolvers that are indexed off of LIBOR, or you have something indexed off of LIBOR, and that's got to change. There is fallback language, right? Automatic fallback language that's been agreed to. Most treasurers said, the last thing I want to do is depend on that. One treasurer said, I don't care how hard I negotiate with my bank counterparty, I'm pretty certain that an extra 25 basis points is going to get added on somehow. Another treasurer said, no, we had a discussion, it's all agreed to, or we agreed to do an amendment when the time comes. So some were very concerned about it and some only partially concerned about it. There is a Federal Reserve sponsored group called the Alternate Rate Reference Committee, the ARC, and there is a non-financial corporate committee that is part of that, and they're very, very involved in making sure that corporate treasurers are prepared for this. And I would argue that while some folks are very proactive about it, especially those on the ARC, there are an awful lot that are sort of waiting. And there's if you talk to your bankers, there's a lot of rates available. You know, of course, there's SOFR, which is currently the primary rate folks are looking at, but there are others. There's the Bloomberg BSBY. And I heard recently from somebody that their banker, a very major bank, had approached them and said, instead of SOFR, why don't you consider this? And so that just adds to the complexity of the situation. We will be publishing a white paper on this after the State of the Treasury, which will be over in about 20 minutes. So, Paul, should I move on?
Yes.
Okay. Then we asked, final question, what is on your project list for 2021? And you can see that the highest urgency items are more a reaction to what has been going on, whereas the longer term requirements are more standard operating procedure. Paul, any thoughts here on the highest urgency items?
Well, I think you're mentioning about Libor replacement. I'm surprised that there isn't more noise and interest in that I'm seeing. And that's the highest urgency. Actually, was the of the high urgency things, it was the fewest they've selected.
Yeah.
I note, and I made a reference to this earlier, you'll see in the middle, the operational procedures, policy and governance improvements. That heightened sense of urgency around that is directly related to people either leaving an organization, having to work remotely, people getting sick in some cases, and too much. A treasurer said there was too much being carried around in our staff's head and not down on like desk manuals where a person could step in and operate a system, log into a TMS, release wires. They felt that they had become way too reliant on people's professional knowledge without having that documented, and way too few people to fall back on. And so that's where that's coming from, and that really resonated with me. I'm a big believer that you should have things documented in such a way that if somebody's on vacation or unexpectedly becomes sick, that their backups have a fighting chance of being able to fill in for them while they're gone. And I see
Yes.
that getting a little bit more attention.
Yeah. And I obviously, being the technologist, we are seeing an awful lot of folks looking to leverage their technology, and the quotes that the various treasurers gave us, it comes down to efficiency and control. So going along your theme of people being able to take vacation, if you leverage technology properly, you can do more with your existing staff. And so a lot of folks were looking at either implementing new systems if they didn't have them. An awful lot of treasuries are still run on Excel. And we log into the bank system and we use Excel, and that's lovely. It does work, but it's a recipe for inefficiency, and it's certainly a control risk. Leveraging, and then an awful lot of folks have some very, very good technology and systems. They may not realize how many good systems they have, and they're looking to optimize what they've got. 2 years ago, we did a study because treasurers said to me, I get about 50% of the value that I wanted to get from, in this case, my TMS investment. I know it can do more. Help me make it do more. Identify what the problems were, the issues were with getting it to be fully realized and valuable to us, and let's correct for those things. So we're seeing both. I'd say it's 60-40. I'm seeing 60% of the treasurers saying, we are going to get what we've got to work better because we know it can, and more efficiently, and eliminate some of those cracks. And that goes along with Paul's points about improving your operational procedures, working to have more straight-through processing, having some of your existing systems interface where they didn't interface before, and that sort of. And then there's the 40% are the folks that say, what we've got really, we've outgrown it, or it was probably never a good idea to be doing it this way, but our hands were tied. But they've been given the remit and the money to go ahead and replace their system. So we're seeing an awful lot more technology selection projects than we have in the last few years. The last few years, we've been doing more optimizing than selecting. So now we're seeing the selections kicking up.
I think a lot of companies coming out of 2020, because of the very difficult economic environment, started cost reduction programs, corporate-wide cost reduction programs. And I think a lot of the projects that we see coming in are related to those larger corporate efforts. We're seeing the Treasury subcomponent of a larger corporate effort. We mentioned here about the card projects to reduce fees. These were very much clustered amongst treasurers who were in wholesale distribution companies and healthcare providers. So these aren't restaurants, it's not retailers. They live and breathe minimizing merchant card expense because it's been part of their business for decades. What healthcare and distribution companies have experienced over the past couple of years, just amplified by the pandemic, is a sharp increase in the proportion of their payments that are coming in by card. And they're not in a position to say no to those. And so they have to manage a growing bank fee related expense through interchange.
Yeah, and I think you look at the furthering of that thought process is the cash and working capital optimization, making sure that you don't have locked pools of cash that you can't take advantage of, and also making sure that your DPO DSO mix is as right as you can make it.
Yeah, let me add that you see industry-wide or even economy-wide working capital stress when an overall economy is contracting very rapidly or when it's expanding very rapidly. So there are lots of clients who had increasing amounts of money invested in their accounts receivable during the contraction in the spring of last year because people weren't paying their bills, right? And so instead of getting paid in 30 or 45 days, they're getting paid in 60, 90 days. Really think about the real estate industry and office space and all of the businesses that weren't able to pay their rent. But the same problem manifests itself if your business is expanding very rapidly. And so I think about the whole supply chain associated with the restaurant business as restaurants reopen, and suddenly orders for product are increasing 20 or 30% a week because restaurants in the entire city are all reopening in parallel. And the suppliers of all of those products, whether it's the food itself or the cleaning materials and the linens used in higher end restaurants, all of a sudden there's a surge, and they have to pay their suppliers, but they have 30 or 45-day terms with the restaurants. That increases the demand on working capital associated with the receivable on that side. So the whole working capital discussion is a much more elevated discussion over, say, the last 14 months than it was in the 14 months that preceded that.
And if our discussion about human capital probably isn't a surprise to you, but it came up so often in every conversation that our recommendation to you is to focus on it somewhat more. I think if you look at some of these other initiatives that treasurers are focused on, it all focuses on helping people be more efficient, not make mistakes, and maybe improve quality of life, because you're sort of taking folks out of mundane, manual, repetitive tasks, and you're focusing on leveraging them for the talent that you hired them for. Right? I remember one treasurer saying, the CFO is going to say to me, "You hired all these MBAs. Why aren't you using them to do this?" And the answer was, "Well, they're too busy putting together where we are financially in order to figure out what we should do. But we're spending so much time figuring out where we are, we don't have time to focus on where we're going." And you've got also, of course, the stresses of working remotely. One fascinating thing I hadn't thought about was somebody told me that, well, when their folks decided to start working remotely and said, "Well, I don't have to be in the city anymore, I'll move somewhere else," the organization started saying, "Well, wait a second, you're in a different tax jurisdiction, and we don't have to pay you like you're working in downtown San Francisco anymore." So there's all kinds of different things that are impacting this. And I can assure you the folks that heard that their salary was going to be adjusted did not react positively to that. So there's positives and negatives to this.
I'll also add, similar to Treasurer's top concern about cyber risk, but it not being the number one thing that they're working on. Here too, the priorities, one of their top concerns is around their staff, especially training new staff, but it's not the top priority in terms of what they're actually going to work on, because most of them don't have the authority to actually make the final decision. So treasurers, like all of us, have opinions about, when we move beyond the pandemic, what does the hybrid model look like? Does that mean somebody comes in 1 day a week or 4 days a week? And there's everything in between. The thing is that the treasurers don't perceive they make that decision. That's the CEO and the HR department that will make company-wide decisions on policy. They don't perceive that long-term they're going to be given the freedom to make decisions about in-office versus out-of-office work schedules, that has to be done for an entire corporate headquarters building. So they think about it a lot, they talk about it, they have opinions, but ultimately they acknowledge that it's not really their decision to make.
Yeah, I think the strategic view of treasurers that I have to build a team, the team has to be efficient and motivated and as happy as they can be. And how do I do that in a distributed environment? And how do I maintain controls in a distributed environment? And all of the other things that go along with it. And we feel, as I mentioned before, the cake is not done. We are evolving to a new normal, and there's some wonderful technologies and capabilities. I mean, Zoom, their stock certainly jumped up. Although I'm also hearing some of the negatives of it. I saw an article about one of the banks saying, please stop having Zoom meetings and just start calling people if you have to. So, and then Paul, wrapping up, I'd like to talk a little about engagements that treasurers have asked us to help with.
Yeah.
these
So this is
are,
like a third perspective. You saw perspective, 50, 90 treasurers taking an online survey. You saw a similar amount being interviewed. And this is the third way to look at what's going on in the Treasury profession this year. This is actually the bulk of our projects we're doing now. Banking card optimization fits in with the overall process improvement theme that we had. The one that surprised me is how many companies came to us to do best practice reviews last year,
roadmaps, right?
and the roadmaps. Yeah. And I think the pattern that is there, as I think about it, a lot of them were new treasurers. They had gone to a new employer and taking over a new department, or there's somebody that was a head of tax or controller that took over a treasury department. A lot of them, but not all of them, originated there. But that was surprising how many of those that we've done in the last year and we're still doing.
Yes, and then when you look at like the TMS selection implementation, one would think in an environment where folks were trying to count every penny and make sure that money didn't go places it shouldn't, I was surprised to see how many folks finally got the approval and authorization to go ahead and select a new system and put it in, because that is not an insignificant cost, and it was a cost that was continually put on the back shelf. But we are definitely seeing quite a jump in that, and I think the vendors have concurred with that. A lot of folks said they've had the best first quarter they ever had. So we're definitely seeing a big jump. And then technology optimizations, that one's not so much a surprise, because you did need to do things like get rid of paper and move to more of an electronic payment methodology, and that does require technology. And also, and I'm a big adherent of this. I really do believe that most organizations don't get the full value from their technology spend, and it's not because the technology is incapable of doing it. It just, there's so many elements to getting full value. So I do encourage you, if after this webinar you're thinking through, well, we should look at our processes, we should look at our technology. Absolutely, there's some great gains to be had by you, and that then frees Treasury up to do more of the strategic things that treasurers want to do. Okay.
That's it.
Well, with that, we'd like to wish you good health and continued success.
Have a great afternoon, everyone.